In a world built on ambition and greed, the story of America's debt is a hidden chapter in financial history, a tale of power, manipulation, and lessons the world refused to learn. From the corridors of Wall Street to the boardrooms where nations are shaped, this narrative explores the rise, the fall, and the silent consequences that changed how money moves. Every moment builds towards a revelation: how decisions made in pursuit of profit reshaped economies, altered lives, and defined the meaning of value itself. As the truth unfolds, one question remains: did we master money, or did money master us? The numbers, as they say, don't lie, but the truth behind them is terrifying. America's national debt has spiraled past $35 trillion, a figure so vast it defies easy comprehension. To put it into perspective, if you were to spend $1 million every single day, it would take you nearly 100,000 years to spend $35 trillion. This isn't just a number on a government ledger. It's a ticking time bomb at the heart of the global economy, and it's far more dangerous than most people realize. The silence from Washington and Wall Street on this issue isn't a sign of control. It's a sign of fear. They know we are standing on a precipice, staring into an economic abyss from which there may be no return. So, how did we arrive at this point? The journey to $35 trillion wasn't a sudden event, but a slow, creeping addiction to borrowing that has spanned decades. It began as a manageable tool, a way for the government to invest in infrastructure, fund necessary programs, and navigate temporary downturns. But over time, temporary measures became permanent fixtures. Each crisis served as another justification to open the floodgates of spending. The financial crash of 2008 triggered massive bailouts, adding trillions to the national balance sheet almost overnight. The response to the global pandemic saw the government inject unprecedented sums into the economy, printing money at a rate never before seen in modern history. Wars in the Middle East, ongoing military commitments, and endless rounds of stimulus checks all came with a price tag footed by future generations. This pattern reveals a dangerous dependency. The U.S. government has become addicted to debt, using newly created money as a solution for every problem. Instead of addressing the root causes of economic instability, the answer has consistently been to borrow more. This cycle has created a fragile system, one that relies on the continuous ability to issue more debt simply to stay afloat. The problem is that debt is not free money. It is a claim on future prosperity, a promise that must one day be honored. The scale of borrowing has now reached a point where that promise is becoming mathematically impossible to keep. The explosion of debt from a few trillion at the turn of the century to over $35 trillion today represents a fundamental failure of fiscal discipline, pushing the nation into uncharted and treacherous territory. This escalating debt has led us into a deadly financial trap, one that often bankrupts individuals, and now threatens to do the same to the world's largest economy, the interest trap. When you owe an enormous amount of money, the interest payments alone can become crippling. For the United States, this is no longer a distant threat. It is our current reality. The annual interest payments on the national debt are now rapidly approaching $1 trillion. Think about that. $1 trillion every single year spent on nothing productive. It doesn't build roads, fund schools, or strengthen our defenses. It is simply the cost of renting money we've already spent. This creates a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The government now finds itself in the absurd position of having to borrow new money just to make the interest payments on its old debt. It's like taking out a new credit card to pay the minimum balance on another. For an individual, this is the final, desperate stage before financial ruin. For a nation, it signals a profound and systemic crisis. This interest trap ensures that the debt will continue to grow exponentially, even if the government were to suddenly balance its budget, which it is nowhere close to doing. Each dollar borrowed to pay interest adds to the principal, which in turn generates even more interest in the future. It's a financial doom loop, and the United States is caught firmly in its grip. The system is no longer sustainable. It is actively feeding on itself, and the pace is accelerating. While the headlines focus on political dramas and market fluctuations, the silent warning signs of this debt crisis are all around us, for those willing to look. The sheer scale of our interest payments has begun to cannibalize the federal budget. The United States now spends more on interest than it does on crucial areas like K-12 education, scientific research, and infrastructure combined. Soon, Interest payments will surpass the entire defense budget, meaning we will spend more servicing our past debts than protecting our future. This is a quiet but catastrophic reallocation of national resources, away from investment and growth, and towards simple maintenance of an unpayable debt. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve has been fighting a losing battle against inflation. It has raised interest rates at the fastest pace in decades, a conventional tool meant to cool down the economy and bring prices under control. Yet, inflation remains stubbornly high. This is a critical warning sign. It suggests that the inflation we are experiencing is no longer just a symptom of a hot economy, but is also being driven by the government's massive debt-fueled spending. The Fed is pushing on the brakes, but the Treasury is flooring the accelerator, and the engine of the economy is beginning to break under the strain. The cracks are also appearing at the ground level, in the lives of ordinary people. Credit card debt has surged to record highs as families struggle to cope with the rising cost of living. Savings accounts, once built up during the pandemic, are now being rapidly depleted. The foundation of middle-class financial security is eroding. We've also witnessed the collapse of several small and regional banks, a direct consequence of the Fed's aggressive rate hikes, which devalued the long-term government bonds that these banks held. These are not isolated incidents. They are tremors signaling a much larger seismic event on the horizon. The system is becoming brittle, and the hidden fragilities are starting to show. Every empire in history, from Rome to Britain, reached a point where its fiscal burdens became its greatest enemy. A sprawling military, a complex bureaucracy, and a populace accustomed to a certain standard of living all had to be paid for. When tax revenues were no longer enough, these empires turned to debasing their currency and accumulating unsustainable debts. It was the beginning of the end. The economic decay that followed eroded their power, their influence, and ultimately their very existence. The United States, with its $35 trillion of debt and an addiction to endless spending, may already be crossing that line. The path we are on is not new. It is a well-trodden road to ruin, and we are ignoring the lessons of history at our own peril. The consequences of this journey will not be confined to America's shores. They will ripple across the entire globe, and the next chapter of this story will explore just how deep that fallout will be. For decades, the US dollar has ruled the world, a symbol of stability and strength. But that dominance is now under a quiet, relentless attack. The very foundation of global finance, built upon the bedrock of American credit, is showing signs of deep and worrying fractures. The financial instability brewing within the US economy isn't just a domestic problem. It's sending tremors across the entire globe, forcing nations to question a system they once took for granted. What happens when the world's reserve currency begins to lose its credibility? We are beginning to find out. The signs of this global shift are no longer subtle whispers. They are clear, quantifiable actions taken by some of the world's largest economies. For years, nations like China and Japan were among the most significant foreign holders of U.S. debt, parking their vast reserves in what was considered the safest asset on Earth, U.S. Treasury bonds. This arrangement was mutually beneficial. It funded America's spending and gave these exporting nations a secure place to store their wealth. But the tide is turning. Citing concerns over America as ballooning $35 trillion debt and the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions, these countries are methodically and quietly reducing their holdings. It's not a sudden sell-off which would trigger immediate panic, but a slow, deliberate retreat, a vote of no confidence expressed in trillions of dollars. This strategic pivot is not happening in a vacuum. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanded to include other major economies, are actively building a parallel financial system. They are conducting more and more trade in their own local currencies, bypassing the dollar-dominated SWIFT system entirely. This isn't just about economic convenience. It's a geopolitical statement. They are creating an alternative to a world order centered around American financial power. This de-dollarization movement is gaining momentum, fueled by a growing, shared fear among nations. The fear that the U.S., buried under an unpayable mountain of debt, can no longer guarantee the dollar's stability. They see a nation printing money with reckless abandon and wonder how long this can last before the value of their dollar-denominated assets simply evaporates. The world is beginning to hedge its bets, quietly building lifeboats before the unsinkable ship shows its first visible crack. To understand the gravity of our current situation, we must look to the ghosts of financial history. The patterns are eerily familiar. Think back to the Great Depression, which began with the crash of 1929. The Roaring '20s were a decade of unprecedented optimism, fueled by rampant speculation and easy credit. Everyone believed the stock market could only go up. Banks offered loans with little oversight, and ordinary people poured their life savings into stocks they knew little about, buying on margin, borrowing money to buy more. This speculative bubble was built on pure confidence, not fundamentals. When that confidence shattered, the entire system imploded. Unchecked debt and a collective belief in a financial fantasy led to a collapse that plunged the world into a decade of economic misery. The parallels to today's debt-fueled economy, where asset prices feel detached from reality, are impossible to ignore. Then, less than a century later, the cycle repeated itself. The 2008 financial crisis was another lesson in the dangers of debt and overconfidence. This time, the speculation was concentrated in the housing market, supercharged by complex financial instruments called mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps. Banks, driven by the pursuit of short-term profits, handed out subprime loans to borrowers who had little chance of repaying them. These toxic debts were then packaged and sold to investors around the globe, disguised as safe, top-rated assets. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of lies and greed. When the housing market inevitably faltered, the dominoes fell with stunning speed. Lehman Brothers collapsed, credit markets froze, and the global economy was pushed to the very brink of total meltdown. In both 1929 and 2008, the core ingredients were the same: a mountain of unchecked debt, rampant speculation, and a dangerous overconfidence that this time is different. Today, with U.S. national debt at a level that dwarfs anything seen in history, we are ignoring these lessons at our own peril. Imagine a world where this trust finally breaks. What happens the day global investors, from the Central Bank of China to a pension fund in Europe, collectively decide that U.S. debt is no longer a safe haven, but a ticking time bomb? This is the domino effect that keeps economists and policymakers awake at night. The first and most immediate consequence would be a massive sell-off of U.S. Treasury bonds. To attract new buyers for its debt, the U.S. government would be forced to offer drastically higher interest rates. The cost of borrowing would skyrocket, not just for the government, but for everyone. Mortgage, car loans, and credit card rates would soar, grinding the consumer economy to a halt. Simultaneously, the value of the dollar on the world stage would plummet. As nations and investors dump dollars for other currencies or real assets like gold, the cost of everything America imports, from electronics and clothing to oil and food, would spike dramatically. This would trigger a wave of hyperinflation unlike anything modern America has ever seen, eroding the savings and purchasing power of every citizen. The stock market, sensing this systemic chaos, would crash. Credit markets would freeze as banks, fearing widespread defaults, would stop lending to each other and to businesses. Companies, unable to get the short-term loans they need to operate, would lay off workers en masse. The result would not be a recession. It would be a complete and total economic collapse, a crisis that would make 2008 look like a minor correction. It would be the unraveling of the entire modern financial system, all triggered by one simple, powerful force: the loss of trust. It's becoming painfully clear that America's greatest threat isn't a foreign enemy with armies and missiles. It's its own balance sheet. The crushing weight of a $35 trillion and rapidly growing debt is a national security crisis hiding in plain sight. It's a vulnerability that leaves the nation exposed to the whims of its creditors and the brutal logic of financial markets. For citizens and investors, this isn't a time for panic, but for preparation and awareness. It means understanding that the financial landscape is changing in a fundamental way. Diversifying assets beyond a single currency, understanding the value of tangible goods, and prioritizing financial resilience over speculative gains are no longer just prudent strategies. They are becoming essential for survival. We are standing at a critical juncture, and the decisions made today, both by our leaders and by individuals, will determine whether we navigate this challenge or become its victim. The system is more fragile than we have been led to believe. When the world's strongest economy begins to fall, it doesn't happen with a bang, but with a whisper. It doesn't happen in a single dramatic event, but in the slow, silent erosion of trust. It happens in the quiet decisions made in boardrooms in Tokyo and Beijing, in the gradual shift of global trade, and in the growing realization that the promises of a debtor nation can no longer be kept. It happens in silence until one day it is all anyone can hear. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the fault lines of the global economy. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and be sure to hit the notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay informed as we continue to uncover the hidden forces shaping our world. We'll see you in the next video.